In Section 9, we're going to wrap up our discussion on unit loading devices. A couple of points to bring forward. All ULDs are identified by a unique ULD number. The details of the number aren't as important for an importer as the fact that a number exists in the first place, especially for containers. We as the importer can create a link not only through an airway bill number, but also through a ULD number to identify our cargo. That's why it's important to point out that ULDs have numbers. Second bullet, a 3-letter prefix identifies the type of container, and then it will be followed by a 4 or 5-digit serial number. If we as importers are regularly using ULDs in an ongoing program, probably not a bad idea to request that the ULD number be linked to the airway bill number. A little bit more detail. A 2-character suffix, an alphanumeric suffix, identifies the owner. And if it's an airline, because ULDs can be owned by freight forwarders too, but if it is an airline, then the 2-letter IATA designator code is used as the suffix. A couple more examples of ULDs on the right. Technically, that metal frame that allows for the transport, the stacking, basically, of automobiles, that's a ULD. A little bit to the left of those automobiles, we can also see another ULD, this time in the form of a pallet. A little more difficult to see, but just another example. Lower right-hand side, something we haven't talked about yet. This type of ULD is used for what is referred to as GOH, garment on hangers. We mentioned GOH briefly in our ocean module, but garment on hangers is definitely a service that is used in the fast fashion space, especially. And we can see how this ULD is used to accommodate what looks to be retail-ready garment on hangers. Here are 3 examples of other ULDs, some of the larger ones actually. On the left-hand side, it's an ALF LD6. We can see that it's contoured to an aircraft. We can see its identifier in the upper left-hand side. Of course, the name of the airline, that's pretty clear too. This ULD is handy because whereas it is indeed enclosed metal frame, we can see on the right-hand side what is basically blue canvas and cargo nets. Ease of loading, but we're still maintaining the integrity of the ULD. One thing we should point out as well, it's a little difficult to see in this particular image, but airlines like to use ULDs, freight forwarders like to use ULDs of this sort that can accommodate a forklift, holes in the bottom of the ULD, so it makes it easier to move the unit loading device around. The real workhorse of ULDs is the one in the middle, that LD7 large pallet, which goes 125 inches in length and 96 inches across. In industry parlance, this is oftentimes referred to as a cookie sheet. If you've ever heard that terminology used in air freight and weren't sure about what it is someone was talking about, this is a cookie sheet. The cargo is literally built up on this cookie sheet based on the characteristics of the cargo. The ball bearings go on the bottom and the ping pong balls go on the top to A, maintain the integrity of the cargo, cartons don't get crushed, and B, make the most use of the cube available in the aircraft. We said this previously. The art of building up pallets to maintain cargo integrity while maximizing payload yield is truly an art. What you see on the cookie sheet in the middle, these are the cargo nets that go over the freight. Oftentimes, especially when freight forwarders are building up pallets, but airlines too, they'll put plastic over the cargo and then wrap with cargo nets. Pretty handy stuff when dealing with rainy season out on tarmacs in Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America. Finally, on the right-hand side, we see a AAX and A1 main deck wide body ULD. Clearly transparent, also clearly contoured to the fuselage of the aircraft, and when loaded on board a cargo aircraft, pushed across the rollers into the aircraft, there will be another ULD on the left-hand side because they butt up in the middle and make the most use of the space in the particular aircraft. Once again, broken record alert, we as U.S. importers need to know who is building up these ULDs. Is it the forwarder and then tendered to an airline, or are goods tendered by a forwarder to the airline as loose cargo and then built up by the airline? That's an important question to know the answer to. Let's look at a particular workhorse for both passenger and the lower deck of all cargo airlines, what is called the LD3, image of which on the right-hand side, somewhat contoured to the round nature of a fuselage. LD3s are good for passenger aircraft because it meets that magic number that we spoke of earlier's requirement, 64-inch height requirement. This is good for below deck cargo. On the left-hand side, we see external dimensions, 79 by 60. There's that 64 height requirement. There are some internal dimensions as well. Let's look at the gross weight, 3,500 pounds with an internal volume. We said about 160 cubic feet. It's actually 153, or a little over 4 cubic meters. The tier weight, the weight of the LD3 itself, is 146, and some dims on the door opening size. This is a very good ULD to use, especially, doesn't have to be, but especially on passenger aircraft. It's not transparent. It's sealable, a little bit smaller, easy to keep track of given its serial number. There's lots of benefits to an LD3. Let's talk some more about some of these benefits of using ULDs. Well, first, air freight forwarders, from a pricing perspective, can negotiate pallet position or ULD rates with the airlines and pass savings on to customers. Once again, the negotiation of pallet positions or sometimes blocked space agreements or ULD rates, those forwarders are a little bit bigger. They have more freight, more leverage to negotiate with the airlines. Second sub-bullet, the tendering of pre-built pallets and or containers reduces handling costs for the airlines. The forwarder's doing all the work. A forwarder in Manila, building up ULDs, building pallets. They're doing all the work and tendering the cargo already good to go to the airline. That's important to the airlines. And that lack of additional handling could drive down the price that the forwarder pays to the airline, which has the potential to be passed on to the importer. Another point, sometimes not thought of, is the potential for later cutoff times to airlines. Airlines are pretty strict about cutoffs. We spoke about that. The last moment at which freight can be tendered to an airline in order to make a specified flight. It stands to reason that if the cargo is tendered on pallets or in a container, it's good to go. There's no handling required at the airline other than loading the ULD onto the aircraft. That might allow for later cutoff times. A quick point on the right, in our image, these are ULDs that are getting ready to be loaded onto a truck, likely, on rollers, pushed down that line onto a flatbed truck, or at least a truck that has rollers in it, or a big jack that can be elevated up to the cargo door. This is an image of a cargo operation, either at an airline or at a large freight forwarder. But those ULDs are on rollers. They'll be moved down either onto a truck or onto a large jack, taken out to the airline. Jack is elevated, loaded onto the aircraft. Continuing on with some of these benefits, if cargo is unitized, there's likely to be a reduction in damages to goods, not getting bounced around. We don't have to worry about 100 cartons loaded loose being damaged. They're all on a pallet or in a container. That enhances cargo security, as we spoke of. And here's a good one. The likelihood of shipments being split is decreased. When goods are tendered loose to a freight forwarder or to an airline, the potential for shipment to be split, sent across multiple flights, is greater. An LD3 that we tender, it's either going to move or it isn't. And when it's booked ahead of time and planned within the aircraft being used, the likelihood of it moving is very high. Loose cargo has a tendency to be split either by the forwarder or the airline for purposes of weight constraints, space constraints, or just cargo mix, meaning that the different characteristics of the cargo on a flight are going to be shipped in a way that it maximizes the revenue opportunity to the airline. Those ping pong balls might get left behind, is another way of saying what we're trying to convey. Last slide in this section, a little supply chain perspective, freight forwarders and cargo unitization. And this is really a summary of much of what we've been saying all along. Air freight forwarders can tender cargo to airlines in a variety of ways, including as loose cartons, palletized, those standard wood pallets, or unitized in a variety of ULDs. Depending on the nature of the relationship the forwarder has with its carrier partners and the volumes of cargo shipped, forwarders can use ULDs that include those cookie sheet pallets that we looked at a while ago, the LD3s that we've talked about a bunch of times, or those larger LD6 models. There are others. These are three. Second paragraph. As a user of air import transportation services, it is essential that U.S. importers understand how their freight forwarders tender cargo to airlines. We've said this a bunch of times. The reasons why an importer has to understand the operational relationship between forwarders and carriers include cargo integrity, making sure cartons don't get crushed, susceptibility to theft and or damage, and the ability to move shipments in their entirety as booked, which is what we just spoke of in the previous slide. Last paragraph. For example, if the forwarder delivers loose cargo at origin, it is up to the airline to build up pallets and load the aircraft. As such, the importer is relying almost exclusively on the airline to ship goods damage-free without cargo being bumped or sent on more than one flight. Conversely, if the forwarder builds its own pallets or containers at origin, the importer must be assured that all cartons are shipped on the same pallet and that all documentation, that house airway bill that we'll be talking about in just a bit, coincides with the piece count of the shipment. Part of the message here is that freight forwarders play a vital role in the air import ecosystem. We as importers have to understand what the freight forwarders do, how they work with the airlines, and ultimately how cargo is moved. That's the theme of this last summary slide. That will be it for this section and our in-depth conversation on ULDs. When we come back, it's going to be the role of the freight forwarder. We shall see you soon.